In the first episode of the Reputation series, I spent time reflecting on the year I lived in my car and how it shaped my idea of personal and professional reputation. Going forward, I'm exploring what this means to others, starting with someone who became the champion, or villain, depending on who you ask, when it came to his approach to the homelessness crisis in LA.
And so I became very outspoken against not doing that stuff. And I became very outspoken about saying that even in the neighborhoods I represented, mostly affluent, mostly white, we needed to have homeless shelter and homeless housing. And that became a real ugly flashpoint. And the narrative became among a lot of people that I was choosing the interests of unhoused people over the interests of housed people, as if that was even a thing.
That's Mike Bonin, former LA City Council member for District 11. He has a lot of experience with personal and professional reputation. From HEATDRAWN Media, this is Reputation, the podcast for nuanced conversation and self-reflection. I'm your host, Ethan Ward, and this season is all about the intersection of reputation, whether it's personal or professional, as it relates to homelessness. In this episode, Mike Bonin reflects on his time in office, the current state of homelessness, and what he hopes history will say about him. In January 2022, Mike announced he wouldn't be seeking a third term.
But over the past couple years, this job has demanded that I focus my time and my energy onto the negative and fighting the negative instead of creating the positive. And that has taken a toll on me, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And it has taken a toll on my family. It's time for me to recharge.
So when we sat down for our virtual chat, I really just wanted to know, how was he? Really?
I am actually doing great. When I decided not to run again, I thought I would have some remorse or some regret, and I have none. I think I am living my best life. I'm in the middle of a trip on my 9-year-old's spring break, visiting family and seeing some historical sites on the East Coast. Just loving life and finding different ways to engage and be productive and make some positive change without dealing with as much of the crap that I got used to dealing with over the last couple of years.
Yeah, you did say that in your retirement video that you were going to be recharging. And so I'm assuming all this traveling and you going to DC with Jacob and all that, you've been with your family now as part of the recharge.
Yeah, a lot of recharging. I mean, it's been very, very intentional. The last couple of years were really, really rough. And, even after I decided not to run again because things were rough and I needed to focus on my family and on mental health, then we had this horrible incident with the racist tapes that got leaked, attacking my family, my son, and me. And it was brutal. So recharging has been really important, but it's come in so many different ways, right? It's hanging with my son. It's traveling. It's doing work with newly elected progressive officials to help them make change. It's finding ways to stay engaged in LA and being able to focus on the things that I enjoy. And not having to focus on all of the negative incoming. And it's really an inspiring time, right? If I had walked away and there had been this right-wing sweep in LA City, I don't know that I'd feel as good as I do now. But there are so many incredible people in the city, around the county, who are doing great work that it's really kind of inspiring to see.
Yeah. I guess I really want to kind of go back. Were you surprised by the amount of vitriol that you faced? I know that you grew up in a family where you had family members who were in the public eye. So I'm wondering if you were kind of prepared for that going into your role and kind of expected it, or was that surprising to you?
I was about as prepared for the job of being an LA City Council member as
Mm-hmm.
anybody could have been. I had worked as a political reporter. I had worked in politics. I had been the chief of staff to my predecessor. I thought I knew the whole thing, and it was something. A couple things happened over the past decade. One of them was it wasn't entirely Trump, but the Trump dynamic in 2016 just unleashed a new level of vitriol and hate and bile in politics at all levels. And it's actually worse in some ways at the local level than at the federal level. I mean, it's insane. And uh, I also got elected at a time of relative prosperity in LA. 2013 was sort of an era of good feelings. We were coming out of the economic collapse, and the city had opportunity and a whole bunch of new elected officials. And I wasn't elected as a hardcore progressive or as a
Right.
socialist, right? I was just elected as a good guy who knew the neighborhoods. And so as crises hit the city and my values called me to a certain
Mm-hmm.
response, I think there's some of the people who voted for me who said, "Wait, this guy's a real lefty," and that created some issues. But there was a point at which I sort of became a lightning rod for the left right division
Mm-hmm.
in Los Angeles, where after we raised the minimum wage, talk radio started focusing on me, and then when Tucker Carlson does a segment on you, when the crazy batshit crazy John and Ken right wing radio hosts
Yeah.
do stuff on you, then all of a sudden you're getting it from all over, and you become the sort of target of choice, and that that happened a lot.
I'm curious though if that was something that when you look back on it, did it seem out of the ordinary, you know, in the sphere of like what is acceptable? Because you have people protesting outside of your house before.
Mm-hmm. It was well. Sadly, it's not out of the norm now.
Yeah.
It was out of the norm when it began, but it was a little bit like the story of the frog in the hot water, right? I mean, it didn't happen just overnight. It sort of
Mm-hmm.
increased gradually. So every step seemed a little bit worse, but it was never like it didn't go nuclear overnight, right? It went nuclear over the course of a couple years. And, you know, honestly, most elected officials on the LA City Council had protesters at their home over the past couple years as a result of the pandemic. Mine was different. Most folks were getting it from the left. I was getting it from the right. I had the anti-vaxxers. I had the people who were opposed to the eviction moratorium. I had it started with people who were opposed to homeless housing and homeless shelter, and then I had people who were outside my house
Yeah.
chanting "White Lives Matter." And it just, I mean, it was really ugly. I think though that the issue that sort of triggered it going nuclear
Mm-hmm.
was over homelessness. And I didn't come at things from like a moral altitude. I started out doing all the stuff all the elected officials do. I was doing supporting criminalization policies and stuff like that, and
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't all that comfortable with them. But I also saw it didn't work. Right? They
Yeah.
failed. They made things worse. They were stupid and they were wrong, and we had to stop them. And so I became very outspoken against not doing that stuff. And I became very outspoken about saying that even in the neighborhoods I represented, mostly affluent, mostly white, we needed to have homeless shelter and homeless housing. And that became a real ugly flashpoint. And the narrative became um, among a lot of people that I was choosing the interests of unhoused people over the interests of housed people,
Right.
as if that was even a thing. And it became an increasingly poisonous dialogue where it went from me trying to provide shelter beds for homeless youth to, oh, see, he's a groomer. He's
Hmm.
sleeping with these young boys and dealing drugs to them. It just got nasty and ugly real quick. And in the culture we live in now, with private Facebook groups, with nextdoor.com, stuff just gets out there. And there have been rumors out there for
Yeah.
months before I've even heard them.
Did you take that personally? I mean, obviously, you have lived experience with homelessness, so that was clearly shaping your perspective and how you wanted to approach policy and the decisions that you made. Was that really surprising to you, though, that your constituents were kind of trying to pit everything as a us versus them situation?
It wasn't surprising to me that there were some people who would do
Hmm.
that. It was surprising to me how much that caught on
Yeah.
and how much that became the powerful narrative in Los
Mm.
Angeles. It became the powerful narrative nationwide in many ways. I mean, what I saw happen over the time I was in office is, um, there's a narrative machine out there, uh, particularly around homelessness, and it happens at multi levels. You've got, sort of neighborhood agitation on Nextdoor.com and some social media
Hmm.
sites, that is really very sort of hateful and filled with bile. I saw neighbors of mine using their names saying, "Let's spray homeless people with bleach and let's douse them with water," and stuff like that. Then you've got, in Los Angeles, one of the local news stations does a segment called Streets of Shame, which focuses on encampments and the horrors of homelessness, not so much the horror of being homeless,
Hmm.
but the horror of having homelessness near you.
Yeah.
Then you've got talk radio, which sort of magnifies that homelessness and crime are the same thing. And then you've got Fox News and Tucker Carlson and magnifying a lot of that on the national level. And you've got folks like Michael Schellenberger, who are putting out this narrative that homelessness is not about housing, it's about drugs. And it's just this multi-level narrative machine. And it went from being people who were sort of right-wing Trumpies to, even people who consider themselves progressive at any other level of government coming on board with that kind of stuff.
Yeah, you talked about the horrors of actually being unhoused. And I remember there was some video that you put out, but you were actually talking about how when your car was in the shop, you would sleep on the beach.
Mm-hmm.
And when I saw that, I like literally my chest got tight because when I was living in my car, that was my worst fear that something would happen to my car while I needed, because I needed
Yep.
my car. It
Yep.
was like, there's no option here. I cannot afford for me to be getting into a collision. I cannot afford for anything to be breaking down. I need this car to sleep. This is my safe haven. So I spent copious amounts of time going out of my way to try to protect my vehicle from where I parked at night to go to sleep. To like, I was
Yep. God forbid you get too many tickets and then you get towed, or yeah.
exactly, I was like avoiding potholes. I mean, I was the most, I think I was
Mm-hmm.
probably the most careful driver I've ever been in my life. Even not just myself, I'm looking in my rearview mirror, making sure no one's too close to me because I can't even afford to not be at fault in an accident. I just need my
Yeah.
vehicle. I don't think a lot of people think about those
Yep.
fears when we talk about that experiences of being unhoused. You said it was like, I don't, when the sun sets, I don't know where I'm going to go to lay my head at night. And that's a very real thing. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't think really a lot of people consider that.
They don't. I think policymakers in general are divorced from the reality of homelessness. Um, Hell, on our city council, there are more landlords than
Mm,
there are renters, right? So, I mean, the council even has a hard time understanding the plight
yeah.
of renters. They just have, most of them have no ability to understand what it is
Hmm.
like to be homeless. So there are times when I spoke, and you're referencing probably one of the longer and more detailed speeches I gave at council, I tried to explain to people what it is like to be unhoused. Uh, I tried to explain to people what it's like when people won't
Mm-hmm.
make eye contact with you, uh, or when when you can't function because you haven't been able to sleep for more than 5 or 6 minutes at a time, uh, or what it's like to be sitting there and all of a sudden the sprinklers turn on and you and everything that you have get soaked. Tried to put a human face on this
Mm-hmm.
for my then colleagues and policymakers. And I did this when we were debating whether or not to expand criminalization of homelessness. And the council members all got up and said, "Oh, Mike, thank you for sharing. That was, very moving. Really appreciated that." And then, all but one of them voted to expand
Mm-hmm.
the criminalization. Um, and for me, it speaks to one of the biggest problems with homelessness and how government responds to it is that almost nobody with any lived experience with homelessness is involved. Addressing homelessness is a
Yeah.
multi-billion-dollar industry, and there is no multi-billion-dollar industry in the world that doesn't spend a ton of money on on customer surveys and figuring
Mm-hmm.
out what customers think. And people who are unhoused in Los Angeles don't get asked what works, what doesn't work. Why is this an acceptable alternative? Why
Yeah.
is this not an acceptable alternative? How does this policy impact you? And one of the things I tried to get done before I left, and I'm hoping Nithya Raman will get it over the finish line for me, is I wanted the council to have a commission of people with lived experience on homelessness. Not my lived experience, not from 20 years ago, people with recent lived experience. And so anytime the council has to debate a policy about homelessness, I want someone who's been unhoused within the past 2 years to be sitting
Mm-hmm.
there at the table in front of them, telling them how it's going to impact them, because that reality is just divorced from policymaking.
I'm curious, when you made that decision to devote your life to public service, you didn't have any fear about, any kind of stigma or people's thoughts about your journey, and you've been very open with about your struggle with addiction before in the past, and it doesn't seem like you struggle with that. Or did you struggle with that?
I don't know that I struggled with it too much. I had been, 15 years sober or so when I
Mm-hmm.
ran for office, and uh, I think by then, if anything, I had an appreciation and uh, a sense of pride and value from my struggles and my failures
Mm-hmm.
and my wounds. Right. I really think that the thing that makes us all beautiful and makes us all special and makes us all strong is the areas where we're broken. Right? To me, when you fall and you break, the place where you heal is really, really holy. So I have always felt that my struggle with housing instability, my struggle with alcohol and drugs, my struggle with mental illness are probably some of the most important and valuable
Yeah.
things about me. And that each of those things, while they were challenges for me, also
Mm-hmm.
made me a better person and made me a better public servant. Yeah, I'm sure there were people who dinged me or voted against me because of
Yeah.
one or another of those things. But for the most part, I think you're always better off just being honest about who you are and being open and being vulnerable. I think a lot of strength and progress comes from that.
I didn't struggle with addiction or anything like that when I was experiencing homelessness. That wasn't part of my story. I kind of want you to touch on that because there are a lot of people that are struggling with addiction, and there are a lot of people that fall into homelessness who then become addicted because they're trying to cope with the circumstances that they're under.
Yep.
And somehow that means for a lot of people that, well, we should just write them off. And I'm kind of hoping that you can kind of touch on that aspect because a lot of what visibly unhoused looks like is I think the more extreme ends of it, when I feel like the vast majority of people are probably like just struggling to afford rent.
Yeah. Wow. The issue of, I mean, the perception of homelessness is so warped, right? I mean, the, people look at, you know, someone near an encampment, walking in traffic, yelling, clearly suffering from some issues, as
Right.
typical homelessness. I'm of the belief that addiction and mental health issues are more the consequence of homelessness than the cause of homelessness. If I, God forbid, if I wound up back on the streets, I can't imagine how I would stay sober through that experience. I just can't. Imagine if you are sleeping on the side of the street. Imagine if you have absolutely no privacy. Imagine if you have absolutely no security. Imagine if you're sleeping in the rain. Imagine if somebody steals
Mhm.
all your stuff. I mean, that is so going to affect somebody's mental health. It's going to magnify somebody's vulnerability. Um, People are going to seek to comfort themselves, and often that's going to make a struggle with addiction manifest more. And that happens for a lot of people. I was using before
Mhm.
I wound up sleeping in my car, but sleeping in my car was not a way to get sober, right? I mean, uh, all of the struggles are intertwined.
Yeah, I recently attended a town hall meeting in your former district. It was like a Q and a to, I guess, to discuss the closing of the bridge shelter that was open there. And I was just curious. So I went, I was like, let me just, it was on a webinar. I logged in and just to kind of see what was going on. And they went through their usual spiel and had, people talking. And then there was the Q&A part, which lasted an hour. Not one time in that hour did anyone who called in to comment acknowledge the humanity of these young people that were using the bridge shelter. And that really bummed me out. I mean, there was a lot of, when are we going to teach them how to take responsibility for themselves? Can't we just move them to another part of town? You all promised this will be closed down in 3 years or whatever the time frame was. But I was really shocked to hear, like, in all this time and all these conversations that we've had about unhoused people, and particularly young people, that this was still the temperature there. And there was a lot of like, oh, we're so glad that we finally have a voice that's listening to us now. It's been so long. And I was just like, Lord have mercy. I'm curious what your take is on that.
Well, I deliberately did not watch the webinar. I lived through many
Right.
a town hall in person on the subject, and didn't want to trigger the PTSD. But everything you've just said is both disappointing and unsurprising. The closest election in the city of Los Angeles was the race to succeed me, and the progressive who cared about solving
Hmm.
homelessness narrowly lost to someone who is really horrible, who has given voice to all of sort of the worst anti-homeless instincts in the district and in the city. And it's frustrating and disappointing that in the middle of a tremendous crisis that everybody in the city is talking about, that everybody in Venice in particular is talking about, there is a movement to shut down an interim shelter and throw out onto the
Mm-hmm.
streets 154 people, 100 adults, 54 youth. I mean, that's actually seriously being
Yeah.
considered. That's just freaking insane. I mean, it's just it's nuts on any level, and I'm sadly unsurprised that there um, were no voices
Mm-hmm.
that acknowledged the humanity of the people who are living on the streets, or the people who are being sheltered at the Venice Bridge housing. Um, One, because unsurprised, because when we did a big town hall attended by over 1,000 people back in 2018 or 19 or so, whenever we were trying to get this through, there was
Mm-hmm.
a young woman named Wendy who got up to speak, who uh, was then homeless in Venice, and people booed her. And at one point, I was trying to tell some stories of people who were unhoused, and somebody in the crowd yelled out, "Don't humanize it." I've noticed there have now been two of these webinars that Councilmember Park has done over bridge housing. I haven't seen them advertised in advance. I've seen
Mm-hmm.
an email like 3 or 4 hours in advance on each one of them, and I am thoroughly convinced that the people who oppose the bridge housing have much more advanced notice of these meetings than the general population or people who support solutions.
I remember distinctly remembering feeling like everyone living at the bridge home had been reduced to drug addicts who were lazy and had mental health issues. And I think maybe one person called in and was like, well,
Mm-hmm.
we can't just close it, and like, we should have a plan to like figure out what we're going to do with these people before we do that, which was like the most rational comment that I may have
Right.
heard that night. But when we talk about people's reputation, I think that is really what's really key, is that there is this perception that just because the person that you saw on this particular day may have been using or may have been having a mental health episode or something like that, that somehow encapsulates every single person that is unhoused. And that is what made me sad, because I was like, I'm sure that there are plenty of people living in that bridge home who just are really grateful to have a place to be, and to hear people in the community
Yes,
like,
there
and
are.
they're going to now suffer indirectly because of this perception that people have of how everyone is. And that to me is really what the problem is.
It's one of the most wrenching and difficult aspects of trying to
Mm-hmm.
solve homelessness, is that um, there is so much invested in the demonization and villainization and scapegoating
Mm-hmm.
of people who are unhoused. I mentioned sort of that multi-level narrative. Um, there's really no dedicated resource out there uh, talking about the stories of people
Mm-hmm.
who are unhoused, of what people are struggling with, and about success stories, about people who have gotten off the streets, who've turned their lives around, and what it has taken. But again and again, you hear stories about violence, you hear stories about mental illness, you hear stories about addiction, you hear stories about failure, you hear stories about relapse, and it's just a pounding narrative that isn't representative of reality. Some of your listeners may be familiar with Mark Horvath, formerly homeless, who runs a
Mm-hmm.
YouTube channel called Invisible People, that tells first person stories of people who are living on the streets. Well, he hands out socks to people, and every now and then he hands out burgers from In-N-Out Burger. Gets a few people together and does a double night. And so I went out with him and bought some burgers, and we were just sitting there on Venice Beach talking with a half dozen people who were homeless. And I met this woman, Alicia, and we were right near
Mm-hmm.
Muscle Beach in Venice, and which is like 18th and Pacific. And I had lived for 15 years a block from there. And I'm talking with this woman, Alicia, who had been homeless on Venice Beach for a couple years. Turns out that she had lived right across the street from me, a block away. And then she wound up moving to Mar Vista and lived 3 blocks
Mm.
from where I was then living. And then, she was in a bad abusive relationship and she wound up out on the streets. She was living in Venice on the beach because it was close to where she used to live, because she felt comfortable, because she she knew the neighborhood. And the longer she was on the streets, the harder it was
Yeah.
for her and the worse she was getting. We eventually got her into the Venice Bridge housing. Um, and everybody says in Venice, or not everybody, but a whole bunch of people say in Venice, it's all about people who are drug addicted and mentally illness, and it's people who are homeless by choice, and
Mm.
it's people who are from somewhere else. Alicia is your neighbor. Alicia has been in Venice longer than most of the people who are objecting to the bridge housing. Uh, Providing the bridge housing is
Mhm.
about Alicia, and there's lots and lots of
Yeah.
stories like hers, and those aren't the stories that get out there, and those aren't the stories that are shaping the public dialogue.
There's just so many misconceptions, and I'm like, where is this coming from? I just don't understand it. What does that look like to really engage the community in a real way? Because clearly there a lot of people are not reading the stories that I was writing at when I was at the radio station, or you know what I mean? Like, I write these stories and I just like, are you
Yeah,
all not
yeah,
reading this work? Like, well, how are you all still this mad at people? I don't get it. And so what needs to happen? Because I feel like, as a journalist, you can do so much. People like Mark Horvath, like you mentioned, he does an incredible job having these very personal stories that he puts out there. And I'm like, okay, well, is that enough? Are we doing enough, like from the government, from a city level, to reach out to people? Are they not hearing it enough from like the mayor's office or something like that?
I don't think they're hearing it enough from the mayor's office. I don't think they're hearing it enough from most elected officials. I don't think they're hearing it enough from uh, the homeless sector or
Mm,
from nonprofits. Yeah, I don't think that there is a ton of thought or effort put into sort of the messaging of how you solve homelessness. Even when the the city does good things, I think the verdict is still out on Mayor Bass's Inside Safe program. I think there are some really good things about it. There's clearly some big shortcomings about it, but um, even as she has moved a large number of people indoors into temporary housing, a lot of the rhetoric that she and others have used has been about the victory of restoring the sidewalks to public use. Right? They've made it about the victory is that you can't see the encampment, as opposed to the victory being someone who's inside and someone whose life is being turned around. And uh, you know, I was as guilty of this as anybody. But often when you're celebrating or you're trying to tell the story of a successful program, it's about, oh, it's 113 people, or it's 74 people, or it's 212 people. It's about the number as opposed
hmm
to the people. And both government and nonprofits tend to suck at storytelling and narrative just generally. And we have to find better ways to humanize both the crisis and the solutions, because this isn't about this is about people, right? I mean, it's tens of thousands of people, but it's about tens of thousands of individuals. I think there's a lot to be said for the personal stories and the touching of humanity to make progress on this.
How do you think history will judge your response to the homelessness crisis in LA? Or how do you hope they will?
Oh wow, that's a question I haven't thought of. You know, to the extent that the city of Los Angeles is, with the current round of more progressive leadership, shifting away from using criminalization as its primary response to trying to move towards a housing and services-led response, slowly and imperfectly, but definitely pivoting. I'd like to be remembered or acknowledged as someone who was sort of a canary in the coal mine on that, who was out there calling for the city to pivot and shift on that. I would like to be remembered as, I'm going to be remembered as the guy who was in the middle of a lot of controversy. That's inevitable, right? So I would like to be remembered as the guy who was in the middle of a lot of controversy because he insisted that, yes, even wealthy white areas need to be doing their part on homeless housing. And I'd like to be remembered as the guy who was in the middle of controversy because he insisted that criminalization only makes homelessness worse and housing ends homelessness. But ultimately, if none of that happens, I'm okay, because when I get to see or talk with someone who has gone through the Venice Bridge housing, or when I get to see or talk to someone, particularly formerly homeless youth, but anybody who's lived in or had their lives turned around by one of the projects we opened, that's more than enough.
Next time, we'll hear from Lisa Chilton, a 65-year-old woman I met while reporting on how seniors are becoming the fastest growing unhoused population. She couch surfed for 5 years and is ready to hold up the mirror and reflect. Reputation is a production of HEATDRAWN Media. This episode was written, reported, and executive produced by me, your host, Ethan Ward. Sound engineering by Jeha Joshua Chang. Original music composition by James Ingram of Mega Dream Productions. Art and graphics by Kelly Bernard. We're grateful for your support. If you haven't yet, please subscribe and rate our feed in Apple Podcast or wherever you're listening now. Or you can share with your friends. Join the conversation on Twitter or Instagram at ReputationPod, or hit me up at I am Ethan Ward. You can also email us at reputation@heatdrawn.com.